In Activity 7, Changes in Water, students experiment with the processes of evaporation and condensation. They infer that it involves a change in the form of water, and finally discover that evaporation and condensation are inverse processes. You will need the following materials from the kit: Activity Sheet 7, envelopes from Activity 6, droppers, tumblers with lids, half petri dishes, plastic trays, blue food coloring, and paper scales. You will also need to provide large container, ice cubes, scissors, and tap water. To prepare for Session 1, make a copy of Activity Sheet 7 for each student. At least a day before the activity, make about 3 trays of ice cubes. Just before beginning the activity, remove the cubes from their trays, placing them into the large container, and place the container in the classroom. Then, cut out the rulers from the paper scale sheet. Fill each tumbler half full with room temperature water and add 5 to 6 drops of food coloring to each. Place a lid on each tumbler. Each team of 2 will need a tray with a dropper, 1/2 of a petri dish, a paper ruler, and a tumbler of water. To begin Session 1, ask students, who knows where rain comes from? Students should understand that rain comes from clouds in the sky. Then ask, does anyone know how water gets up in the sky? Accept all reasonable answers. Next, divide the class into teams of 2. Have each team select a flat area where their materials can be set up and left undisturbed for the rest of the day, such as a windowsill or a bookcase top. Distribute the students' journal envelopes, Activity Sheet 7, and the materials. Instruct the teams to put the paper ruler on the tray and to place the petri dish on top of the ruler. Fill the dropper with water from the tumbler, and then squeeze enough drops onto the dish to make a large drop about 4 centimeters wide in the center of the petri dish. Put the lids back on the tumblers. The drop should be over the ruler so the students can use the ruler to measure the width of the drop. Have the students record the size of the drop and the time on the top half of the activity sheet. Then instruct them to set their petri dishes aside on the tray. Ask students, what do you think will happen to the water in the dish over the next few hours? Explain that they will return several times to observe the dish and record their observations. Next, tell students to pick up the tumblers you distributed and ask, how does the outside of the tumbler look? How does it feel? If the students do not mention it, point out that the tumbler feels dry. Have each team put 3 to 4 ice cubes in their tumbler. Cover it and set it on the tray. Then ask students, what do you think will happen to the ice and water over the next few hours? Students should suggest that the ice will begin to melt and that the water and tumbler will get colder. They may also suggest that the color in the water will become less intense. At 1-hour intervals for the rest of the day, have the students measure the width of the drop and record the width and time on the activity sheet. If possible, continue until the drops have totally evaporated. Also, at the same time, have the students feel the outside of the tumbler and record their observations. Have them continue until the outside of the tumbler is completely moist. Make sure to continue with Session 2 before the ice in the tumblers is totally melted. To prepare for Session 2, the students will need their copies of Activity Sheet 7. To begin Session 2, have the students review the data on their activity sheets and describe what they have observed. Ask students, what happened to the water drop? Students may say that the water disappeared, went into the air, or that it evaporated. Explain to the class that water exists in the form of a liquid, a solid, and a gas, and that in its liquid form, water is called water. Ask students, what do we call water when it is in the form of a solid? Students should know that solid water is called ice. Some students may also mention snow or frost. Then ask students, does anyone know what we call water when it is in the form of a gas? Some of the students may understand that water in its gas form is called water vapor. Explain that water vapor is simply water in the form of a gas, which is created through evaporation, and that evaporation is the process by which matter changes from a liquid to a gas. Help the students understand that water vapor is not visible. If they suggest that they can see steam and fog, explain that steam and fog are composed of tiny water droplets, not water vapor. Ask students, where does water vapor go once it evaporates? If the students do not know, help them understand that water enters the air when it evaporates. Based on what they have just learned, lead the students to realize that the water in the petri dishes evaporated into water vapor. Then ask students, do you think the water will come out of the air again? What do you think happens to water vapor? Accept all reasonable answers. Next, have students review their observations of the tumbler. Ask students, what happened to the outside of the tumbler? Students should note that the droplets of water formed on the outside of the tumbler. They should also observe that the water on the outside is clear and that the water inside remains blue. Then ask students, where do you think the water on the outside of the tumbler came from? Students may suggest that it came from the air or from the tumbler. At this point, they should understand that it couldn't come from inside the tumbler because the lid is closed and the water inside the tumbler is blue and the water on the outside is clear. Next, ask students, does anyone know what condensation is? To help students understand condensation, explain that the warmer the air is, the more water vapor it can hold, and that the cooler the air is, the less water vapor it can hold. So water vapor condenses out of air as it cools. Further explain that condensation is the process by which a gas changes to a liquid, and that water formed by condensation is also called condensation. Then ask students, why do you think condensation formed on the outside of the tumbler? Help the students recognize that the tumbler was chilled by the ice water. The air around the tumbler and the water vapor in the air were chilled by the tumbler. The water vapor that cooled condensed on the outside walls of the tumbler and became liquid. Finally, review condensation and evaporation with the students using figure 7.2. Inform the students that the processes of evaporation and condensation are in some ways considered opposites. To conclude session 2, return the paper rulers to the kit. Wash and air dry petri dishes, droppers, and tumblers, and return them to the kit along with the plastic trays and food coloring. For science background, reinforcement activities, curriculum connections, and information about the Delta Science Reader, please consult your DSM Teacher's Guide.